The first thing you need to understand about the Sherman tank is that when it took a hit, the danger didn't end with the steel plate being pierced. For the 4 or 5 men inside, those next few seconds were often the most important of their lives. And that is what we're going to explore today. Step by step, what really happened to a Sherman crew the moment enemy fire found them. By 1944, the Sherman was the backbone of Allied armor. Reliable, mobile, easy to produce in massive numbers. Over 49,000 of them rolled off American lines. But the tank's greatest weakness was no secret. Its armor simply wasn't designed to withstand the high-velocity 75mm and 88mm guns of German Panthers and Tigers. Crews themselves had a grim nickname for their own vehicle, the Ronson, after the lighter brand, because once hit, it seemed to ignite every time. So, what actually took place inside when a round penetrated? Imagine 4 men squeezed into a space barely larger than a small car. The driver and co-driver sat forward, practically shoulder to shoulder. Above them in the turret were the gunner, the commander, and usually the loader. All of them surrounded by stacked ammunition and fuel tanks, separated from the outside world by just a few centimeters of steel. A German armor-piercing round striking the hull didn't just punch through. It sprayed molten steel fragments, known as spall, in every direction. These fragments could shred equipment and flesh alike. The sheer kinetic force could knock men unconscious instantly. If the round detonated inside, the temperature could spike within seconds, igniting propellant cases or gasoline vapors. That was when the tank truly became a death trap. For the crew, the reaction had to be immediate. The loader often moved first, dropping whatever shell he was holding and lunging for the hatch. The commander would be shouting, trying to account for everyone while smoke filled the compartment. If the fire caught quickly, oxygen disappeared. Breathing became impossible in under half a minute. Those who couldn't move fast enough were overcome before they even reached the hatch. But not every hit meant instant destruction. Sometimes, the shell disabled the suspension, blew apart the engine, or punched a hole without setting off a fire. In those cases, the tank was crippled but still intact. Crews then faced a brutal choice: remain inside a powerless hulk or bail out into open ground under enemy eyes. German gunners often waited, knowing men would try to escape and cut them down as they ran. Staying inside was rarely an option. The next hit usually finished the job. And here is where the Sherman story becomes even more complex. Despite knowing these odds, crews climbed back in day after day. They patched their tanks, replaced burned uniforms, and went back to the front. Because at its core, the Sherman wasn't just a machine. It was a shared coffin that men trusted one another to keep alive. If one froze, all could die. If one kept his head, all might escape. This was the cruel balance of the Sherman. Numbers, speed, and production kept the Allies rolling forward. But inside each steel box, survival after a hit came down to seconds, discipline, and sheer luck. And that's only the surface. In the next part, we'll break down exactly what those seconds looked like. The flash, the smoke, the desperate scramble, and what happened to the men who got out and those who didn't. If you want more deep dives into the realities of tank warfare, make sure to subscribe and like. Because the story of a Sherman hit isn't just about the tank. It's about the men trapped inside and how they fought to live. When a Sherman took a hit, survival depended on one thing above all: seconds. Let's go step by step through what usually happened inside after an armor-piercing round slammed into the tank. First, the impact. To the men inside, It felt like being inside a steel drum when a sledgehammer hit it, only multiplied by 10. The noise was deafening, often disorienting. Dust and smoke blasted through the crew compartment as the round either passed through or detonated. Steel fragments, spall, shot in every direction, slicing into flesh, ricocheting off armor walls, embedding in radios, periscopes, even helmets. Many tankers described it as an explosion of knives. If the hit ruptured a fuel tank or caught stacked ammunition, the result was catastrophic. Gasoline vapors ignited almost instantly, creating a fireball that swept through the cramped space. Ammunition racks could cook off in seconds. In a Sherman, this meant the propellant charges for 75mm shells went up like a chain reaction, turning the turret into a furnace. When this happened, the crew had no more than 15 to 20 seconds to escape before the tank became impossible to survive inside. That's why drills mattered. Crews practiced bailout procedures again and again. The loader was usually the fastest. He had a hatch above him and often scrambled out first. The commander tried to check if the driver and co-driver could move. These men had the hardest time escaping. Their hatches were small, positioned low at the front, and often jammed if the tank was hit head-on. Many drivers never made it out. If the turret crew could climb through the hatches, they often emerged dazed, coughing, uniforms scorched. Some dragged wounded comrades with them. Others had to make split-second decisions to save themselves or burn with the man next to them. Veterans recalled the smell of fuel, rubber, and burned clothing staying with them for years. But escaping the tank was only half the danger. Once outside, the men were exposed. German gunners had a grim tactic. They would fire again at the disabled Sherman, then rake the ground with machine gun bursts as the crew tried to run. Survivors learned to throw themselves flat, using the wreck of their own tank as cover, or crawl through ditches if they were lucky enough to find one. The physical injuries were brutal. Burns, shrapnel wounds, broken bones from the shockwave. But the psychological scars were just as deep. Men who escaped often described survivors' guilt, remembering the faces of crewmates who never made it out. Tank units rotated new replacements in quickly, but the bond inside a crew could never truly be replaced. Each man knew that the next hit might be his last, yet every morning they climbed back in. And here's the harsh reality. Allied command knew Shermans were vulnerable. They relied on sheer numbers to overwhelm the battlefield. One Sherman might be knocked out, but there were always more behind it. For the crewmen, though, each tank wasn't just a number. It was their world, their home, their coffin, and their only chance to push forward. That's what made their courage stand out. They weren't blind to the odds. They knew the German 88mm could burn them alive from a mile away. They knew the enemy sometimes waited for them to escape, only to cut them down in the open. Yet they stayed in the fight, because the man next to them would not survive alone. Now, here's where I want you to join the conversation. Tank warfare wasn't only about machines. It was about men and the decisions they made in seconds under fire. So tell me, what tanks do you know that left the biggest mark in history? Maybe it's the Sherman, the Tiger, the T-34, or something more modern. Drop it in the comments. I'll be reading them. Escaping a Sherman after a hit was not the end of the story. For many crews, it was only the beginning of another brutal chapter. Survival outside the tank. The first minutes were chaos. A burning Sherman became a beacon on the battlefield. Smoke pouring upward, ammunition popping like fireworks. Crews that managed to bail out often found themselves stumbling across open fields or ruined villages, trying to orient themselves while artillery and machine guns kept hammering. Some men ran straight back toward friendly lines. Others froze in place, unable to believe they were still alive. Those who were wounded had the hardest time. Burns covered their hands and faces, clothes fused to their skin. Medics described cutting scorched uniforms away while the soldier beneath screamed, his body shaking from shock and pain. Shrapnel wounds were everywhere. Tiny steel fragments buried deep, tearing through muscles and organs. Battlefield hospitals near Normandy and later in the Ardennes filled with tankers who had survived the fire, only to face months of surgery and recovery. But not all survivors made it back to medical care. Many were captured. In France, crews bailing out under fire often fell into German hands within minutes. Prisoners reported being stripped of weapons and marched away, while their tanks still burned in the background. Some never even reached POW camps. Frontline troops sometimes treated captured tankers harshly, especially if they had inflicted losses earlier. For those who did escape safely, there was the emotional weight. A Sherman crew was like a family. Losing even one man shattered the group. Survivors often described looking at the empty seat in the turret, hearing echoes of voices that weren't there anymore. Tank units replaced men quickly. New drivers, new loaders, new gunners. But the bond never felt the same. Commanders wrote in their diaries that keeping morale together was as hard as keeping the tanks running. And yet, replacements kept climbing in. Some were fresh recruits barely out of training, others were seasoned infantry reassigned to tanks. Veterans tried to teach them fast. How to listen for the sound of an incoming round, how to duck when the gunner shouted, how to grab the hatch lever without hesitation. Those lessons could mean the difference between life and death. Meanwhile, engineers back home worked desperately to improve survivability. They developed so-called wet stowage ammunition racks, designed to reduce the risk of fire by surrounding shell storage with water jackets. This lowered the chances of catastrophic explosions after a hit by nearly 75%. Crews who received the upgraded Shermans reported more confidence, but they still knew that no tank was truly safe. And that's an important point. A hit did not always mean total destruction. Many Shermans were knocked out, but later recovered, repaired, and sent back into battle. Workshops just behind the lines worked around the clock welding new plates, replacing engines, repainting scorched hulls. Some crews even returned to the same machine they had once abandoned in flames, climbing back inside the very steel box that had nearly killed them. For them, it was a strange mix of pride and dread. Trusting the same tank again, but knowing its scars better than anyone. What stands out most from veterans' testimonies is the resilience. These men were not superheroes. They were ordinary soldiers facing extraordinary danger. They knew the odds. They had seen friends burn. And still they climbed back in, turned the key, and drove forward into the smoke. For them, the war wasn't about statistics or production charts. It was about staying alive one more day, fighting one more battle, and bringing as many of their brothers home as possible. That's the reality after a Sherman was hit. Escape, injury, capture, or return. Each path was brutal in its own way, and yet together, these experiences formed the backbone of the Allied armored push across Europe. By the end of the war, the story of the Sherman tank crew after a hit had become part of the larger story of Allied victory. It was a story written not only in steel, but in the lives of the men who rode inside. Statistics tell one side. Thousands of Shermans destroyed, thousands more repaired and sent back. Casualty rates among crews were staggering: burns, amputations, blindness, psychological trauma. But behind every number stood a crew that had faced the nightmare of being struck and either walked away or never came back. For commanders, this became a brutal calculation. They knew that to win, Shermans had to keep moving forward, regardless of the losses. Tanks were expendable, men were not. But on the battlefield, that line blurred. Crews were ordered to hold positions under fire, to attack entrenched German defenses, to keep pressure on the retreating enemy. Every time, they climbed in knowing full well what could happen if a single shell found its mark. And yet, the Sherman delivered something critical: numbers. No tank fought alone. One Sherman might be knocked out, but 5 more pressed forward. The philosophy was harsh but effective. Overwhelm German armor with sheer weight of machines and men. It was costly, but it worked. From the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Cologne, Shermans rolled forward, burning, exploding, breaking down, but always replaced. For the crews, survival often meant living with the scars. Veterans spoke of waking in the night years later, smelling smoke that wasn't there, feeling the heat of a fire long gone. Others carried burns on their skin for life. Many never spoke of what happened inside when the tank was hit, because words could never capture the sound of ammunition cooking off, or the silence that followed when a friend didn't climb out. And yet, they remembered the bond. More than anything, that bond defined their war. 4 men inside a steel box, trusting one another completely. The driver keeping steady hands, the gunner holding aim, the loader moving faster than thought, the commander watching over them all. When one man fell, the rest carried his memory into the next battle. That bond was the reason they climbed back in, again and again, despite knowing the risks. Today, when we look at the Sherman, it's easy to see it as just another tank, outdated, under-armored, mass-produced. But inside, it was never just a tank. It was a world of fear and courage, a place where seconds decided everything, where ordinary men faced extraordinary choices. So, what really happened to a Sherman crew after a hit? Sometimes they burned. Sometimes they crawled free, coughing, bleeding, half-blind. Sometimes they returned to fight again. Always, they carried the weight of those moments for the rest of their lives. And that is the true legacy of the Sherman, not its armor thickness or its gun caliber, but the men who rode it, fought in it, and paid the price for victory.